Securing the US critical mineral supply chain has been a top priority for the Trump administration from day one. The US is heavily reliant on foreign resources for these essential minerals, which is why the administration is advocating for an agreement with Ukraine to access the country's rich mineral resources. Well, to delve into the complexities of this potential deal and the lessons learned from other natural resource agreements in unstable regions, I'm joined in the studio by Daniel Litvin, a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics, and he's also the founder and CEO of Resource Resolutions. Hi, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Yeah, good to be here.
Well, can we begin by examining why is President Trump seeking these critical mineral deals with Ukraine? Because, considering his skepticism regarding climate change.
Well, as you suggest, one of the uses of critical minerals is to build clean energy infrastructure, whether that's electricity grids or electric vehicle batteries and so forth. As you say, President Trump is something of a skeptic on climate change, but these critical minerals also have other uses in the defense sector, in aerospace, and also in IT. So, putting climate change to one side, critical minerals are critical right across the economy. So, there's economic motivation beyond concern for the environment, and the this U.S. administration has now it's something of a pattern of eyeing critical mineral deposits in parts of the world like Ukraine, Greenland, and indeed now perhaps more recently the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Um, uh, but using, I think countries have or major powers have for several years now wanted to gain more access to these minerals, but it's just the tactics being used by this U.S. administration is obviously raising many eyebrows.
Well, can we look at this Ukraine deal? Because it seems that they thought a deal might be coming this week, but now I think there's obstacles again. What do you think this would look like eventually?
Time will tell. That there's obviously been incredibly tense relationship between President Trump and President Zelensky, and it's difficult to know what the final deal will look like if and when it is signed. But certainly the earlier drafts of the deal and the reporting around the deal suggests that it is being the approach being adopted by the US is pretty transactional and it looks as though it's seeking to extract sort of maximum benefits from the deal. And perhaps the big question is how, from Ukraine's perspective, how palatable would that be? And if it's not palatable to Ukraine, how sustainable um, for the long term is a deal like that?
But do you think there could be a win-win situation?
Well, in theory, there's a very very big win-win for both sides. For the U.S., it's securing supplies of these important materials. For Ukraine, it's uh, having a significant and politically powerful partner to help develop those resources. But the way in which it's being pursued, it doesn't look very win-win. And obviously, there's a fair degree of skepticism as to whether is this win-win or is this exploitation? And if it again, time will tell. But if it turns out to be an unbalanced deal, in other words, it is more about serving America's rather than Ukraine's economic interests. That the history of um, resource deals is that whether it's over a space of a few years or a decade or two, deals that are perceived to be unfair by the host country, in other words, the country that hosts the minerals, they usually get rewritten at some point, or lead to such local backlash and political pressure that they have to be revised in some way.
So is this what the Trump administration should be careful of, that they don't push Ukraine so hard that eventually it's such an unpalatable deal that there might be a backlash?
Yes, I think that's a clear uh, factor that the US negotiators need to think about. the securing, again, the history of resources suggests that securing minerals for the long term, or securing resources for the long term, is not about being a strong man and extracting the maximum possible right now. The way to secure resources for the long term is to strike deals, but do deals in such a way that they bring and are seen to bring, sufficient local and national economic benefit, and are done in an environmentally and socially responsible way. And that's the way that you get local support, for these sort of resource deals. This is, again, we'll see what happens with how the Ukraine-US mineral deal pans out, but that's the clear danger to my mind.
Have you got some examples of these deals in the past and how it panned out?
Oh, sure. Well, there are examples from many centuries of history, right? Of foreign powers. A lot of conflicts and wars have been fought over gaining access to resources, whether that's water or minerals or oil and gas, particularly in the 20th century. And say, if you look, a classic example is all the deals that were struck by Western powers in the Middle East to gain access to the oil and gas reserves of the Middle East, countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Iran and so forth, in the middle of the 20th century. And initially, the deals that were struck, because a lot of them were struck as, still in the days of empire, or when imperial approaches were still dominant, and they were manifestly unfair to many of the oil and gas rich Middle Eastern countries. And what happened in the 1960s and 70s was this sort of a surge in nationalist feeling, what's sometimes described as a resource nationalism, where for all these foreign backed deals were sometimes expropriated, or the terms were changed so as to be much more beneficial for the host countries. But that whole process of change was very, very disruptive for the West, including for America. The oil shocks of the 1970s, for example, were driven by this, partly driven by this resource nationalism. So there's a lot. I could give many others. There are many examples currently in the mining industry of foreign companies, Western companies, and companies from other countries having deals in regions of Africa, for example, which the local population and the local governments see as unfair. They're extracting too much of the profits and not returning enough. Now, whether that perception is fair or not, that perception right now is leading to a lot of challenges to the ownership of these resources by the Western companies, and a lot of attempts by governments to claw back more of those perceived benefits.
Well, you mentioned Africa, the DRC. Why would President Trump be pursuing a deal there?
Well, the DRC is rich in resources. It's rich in a lot of these critical minerals that are essential, whether it's for the energy transition or for defense and all those other key industries. So it's very rich in cobalt. It's very rich in copper, for example. And President Trump, like as I mentioned, I think earlier, that in whether it's in Greenland, Ukraine, or elsewhere, and indeed, interestingly, in the first President Trump's first term, he was very interested in the critical mineral wealth of Afghanistan, and there was talk at that point that perhaps in partly in return for U.S. support at that point, military support for Afghanistan, there should be some sort of quid pro quo where Afghanistan opens up its critical mineral reserves to American investment. So the DRC is similar in that respect, very rich in minerals. One important thing is that the DRC, like a lot of other regions, has become well, there's been a significant increase in Chinese investment in the minerals of the DRC, and in a sense, where there was there were some very significant U.S. investments in copper, for example, in the DRC, but they were sold to the Chinese several years back. So President Trump is famously, as many in America are, famously worried about growing Chinese dominance, and it's Chinese dominance of these so-called critical mineral supply chains that is worrying. So the DRC is another sort of, again, mineral-rich region which is seen to be strategically important. The really interesting thing, or one of the many interesting things, is what's happening now is the tactics and techniques that the Trump administration is using to seek to gain control. again, Greenland, Ukraine, and DRC. This is not standard stuff. I mean, in the case of Greenland, obviously, the suggestion of acquiring by whatever means the territory. The Ukraine deal, the proposed deal, is very unusual in its scope, and likewise, the reports around a potential US deal with the DRC seems to focus around getting minerals in exchange for providing security.
Hmm.
That's not a typical approach. And in a sense, the most obvious recent parallel to that is the Wagner Group, which in many parts of Africa is reported to be offering or has offered security in return to access for minerals. So there's a really big questions as to the tactics being used. And my what I would suggest to come back to an earlier point is that the way to secure minerals for the long term is to offer development above all, and offer a sustainable, environmentally and socially supportive approach to extracting those minerals. I think when one gets to you muddling security in this issue, again, history again suggests that often doesn't end very well.
Well, in this whole muscle for minerals deals, isn't it a prerequisite that there has to be peace, which in a place like the DRC seems really remote?
Well, so that you're right that one needs absolutely stability and peace in order to build a successful long-term mining project. There are parts of the DRC that are much more peaceful than others. It's obviously there's a particular conflict raging in the eastern DRC, but this comes to the point perhaps you're alluding to, in Ukraine, where there's a suggestion, I think, from the US that the mere involvement of American business people and investment in Ukraine minerals will provide a bit of a security guarantee for Ukraine, in the absence of troops or physical military security, I guess. And again, I think that needs to be thought about very carefully, because I keep referring to the history of minerals and politics, but there's a very rich history there and a lot of lessons to be learned. And one is that not to assume that, or to understand that when mineral investment happens and it leads to significant profits, and generation of wealth in a politically unstable region, it tends to, or there's a high risk of it leading to more conflicts, as other parties eye those profits and realize that they can try and capture them in the absence of the rule of law. And so, I am not privy to any conversation, obviously, between Presidents Trump and Putin, but if America is very successful in helping to extract Ukraine's critical minerals, and that's near the any Russian controlled territory, that there I think just the mere fact of American business people being on the ground it seems to me a weak security guarantee.
Well, you said that these deals should be watched not only geopolitically, but also in terms of their impact on climate change. Why did you say that?
Well, so as mentioned, critical minerals are essential components, or inputs to all those all those bits of kit, I guess, that are needed for the world to decarbonize, whether that's building more electricity grids, for which copper, for example, is essential, whether it's building electric vehicles, solar farms, wind farms. So you need a lot more of these materials like copper, lithium, cobalt, etc. And so, even though that may not be President Trump's motivation in this proposed Ukraine deal, Europe, I'm sure, should be watching this very closely from a climate perspective, because one of the big challenges for Europe, which is still remains on the firmly committed, and to my mind rightly so, to climate action, is looking to develop a significant um, electric vehicle industry, for example, which is currently, and again, a lot of these critical mineral supply chains are dominated by China. So having a successfully and sustainably exploited set of critical mineral deposits in Ukraine, in other words, on Europe's doorstep, could really help to build those the clean energy industries that Europe wants to develop for the future. So this does matter for climate change, not just for geopolitics.
Are there good examples of where it went really well in one of these deals?
Well, there are certainly, there are over time many countries. Well, while there are quite a few countries that have not benefited from their minerals, there are some countries that clearly have. A country famously in Africa that has done not bad at all from its minerals is Botswana, and diamonds that haven't been the sole reason, of course, for Botswana's relative economic success in Africa, but are part of the reason, and that comes down to good government policy, to a good, very very long term partnership between De Beers, the diamond producer, and the government of Botswana, where there's been give and take on both sides, and I think generally an attempt to generate local and national economic benefits and to exploit those resources sustainably, not always perfectly. So there's been a good effort there. But what is really, really important for deals to work is I think for countries to have less of a focus on the minerals under the ground themselves and who extract them. It's what they do with them, and the value chains, like the processing of those minerals, and as sometimes called beneficiation, refining of those minerals. And again, to give another example from history, the United Kingdom, where I'm based, this is really long history, well in the past, but without its coal reserves, Britain probably wouldn't have had its industrial revolution that allowed it to be the dominant economic and geopolitical power for many, many decades. But it was not just the fact that it had these coal reserves, that it was able to put them to use through the use of new technologies, the steam engine and so on, and the sort of right sort of governance and industries whose growth was triggered by that. So this is, I think, quite often particularly governments will get a little bit too focused on who controls the stuff under the ground, because that's sort of almost easy. I think it's easy to grasp, but it can lead to conflict as well, because everyone's scrambling for the same resources. And there's, by the same token, often too little focus on what do you need to put in place to create real sustained economic growth from all the industries associated with mineral extraction. And that's a much more difficult task. It requires cooperation and collaboration between sectors and between governments and companies. So I think sadly at the moment the world has gone a little bit transactional in the short term, and it doesn't bode well for these sort of long-term partnerships, I think.
Do countries, especially African countries, know what's under the ground when they start negotiating these possible deals on critical minerals?
It's a good question. I mean, sometimes they do have good geological surveys. Sometimes it's the companies that need to do the exploration. And that's why there's often this perception of unfairness, because, okay, from a company's perspective, they feel that they will have spent a lot of money exploring, and say they find a big deposit of copper or gold or whatever. And so they will say, well, now, having spent this fortune, a great risk, because they could have found nothing. And in many exploration campaigns, they find nothing. Therefore, they want to reap the benefits from all the risk, all that capital they put at risk. From a government perspective, foreign company comes along, finds this motherlode of wealth under the ground, and then seems to want to take a disproportionate share of the profits, and whereas often the country concerned may be poor. So that this is the mining industry is sort of almost prone to perceptions of unfairness and mistreatment on all sides, which is one of the reasons why it's so riven with disputes and conflict, I think. But sorry, so geological surveys, it's a good question. And in the case of Ukraine, its geological surveys, by all accounts, are a little bit out of date. So the some of the estimates of how much wealth there is in terms of Ukraine's critical minerals have probably been vastly overblown, and we don't really know. And put it this way, if it was established that Ukraine had the tens or hundreds of billions worth of profitable critical minerals, there would have been many more mining companies exploiting it until now. But yeah, that clearly hasn't happened yet.
What would a good deal look like, especially because Ukraine is the one right now in front of us?
I think a deal, between US and Ukraine needs to be thought through from a long-term perspective, not months, not years, but actually decades, and needs to benefit both sides over the decades. I think it needs to focus not just on who controls and profits from the mineral extraction, but the development of associated industries, refining, processing, potentially, parts of the electric vehicle supply chain and other associated industries. And it needs to be done in a very, I think, environmentally and socially sustainable way. And that's not just for ethical reasons, but for reasons of self-interest that particularly America does not want to, as many Western countries found in the Middle East again in the 20th century, they were booted out because they were seen to not to be behaving well. So there's a lot. There is a potentially, I think, a huge win-win, but it's at the moment it's difficult to see how the parties are thinking in that way.
Is this where a resource resolution comes in? Do you mediate some of these deals?
So the focus of resource resolutions is to try and reduce some of the division and conflict around natural resources in various different parts of the world, which are, and the level of conflict and division is bad, and there's a risk that it gets worse in the coming years because of geopolitical divides and also just a general lack of trust between companies and communities, or communities and government. So the aim of resource resolutions is to act as a impartial party, to listen to both sides and see where these potential win-wins might lie.
So who would bring you in? The mining companies?
The mining companies, it could be renewable energy companies, it could be governments, and it could be philanthropists. It's any group that sees an interest in resolving some of these issues. And usually, it is everyone often in these disputes is thinking in a quite a short-term and win-lose way, that if enough, I'm going to lose. The reality is that if all parties can be uh, uh, find a way to think long-term, the win-wins become more apparent. And so that's the aim of resource resolutions, is to help parties to unearth some of those.
Daniel Litvin, thank you so much. I mean, it's very topical at the moment. Thank you for speaking to us.
Thanks very much.